Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us for the NARM Online Basics Training to become a NARM-Informed Professional. This is the Level 1 training in the neuroaffective relational model for helping professionals working with complex trauma. This professional training is designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. This training is for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, body workers, and more. In this online training, participants will learn more about the changing field of trauma, a deeper understanding of the impacts of ACEs and complex trauma, and how NARM, one of the first models specifically designed to address CPTSD, can support professionals in the growing trauma-informed field. This NARM Online Basics Training will be taught by NARM senior faculty members Brad Kammer and Stephanie Klein, as well as a team of experienced NARM trainers with special instruction by NARM creator, Dr. Lawrence Heller. If you are looking for more advanced training in understanding the impacts of attachment, relational, developmental, and intergenerational trauma, and you're working in healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or allied fields, please join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-Informed Professional. The next NARM Online Basics Training is starting in September 2021 and will run one weekend a month through December 2021. 60 continuing education units will be available for most helping professionals. Register now to reserve your spot. Please visit www.narmtraining.com/onlinebasics. We hope you'll join us in learning how to transform trauma. Today I'm speaking with Kathy Nielson. Kathy's work is rooted in North Minneapolis, a community full of joy and aptitude where 84% of residents are people of color. Many are rising through complex trauma, racial trauma, and generational poverty. Kathy wears several hats. One as the head volleyball coach at Minneapolis North Community High School. She's also the owner of Lion's Fire, a mobile wood-fired pizza social venture with a purpose to employ, train, and journey with female student athletes in North Minneapolis. She's also the co-founder of a small neighborhood-based nonprofit called Lions, Inc., which is focused on gathering and sharing relational and financial resources to support a new generation of young people and young families as they move from survival toward emotional and financial flourishing. I know you'll enjoy today's amazing conversation with Kathy Nielson. Kathy, welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for being here. We are so excited. You are currently, as we're recording this, in the online basics training right now.
Right.
So that's how you came to this podcast. But I'd love for you to start with our usual question. I know you said you've listened to the podcast a lot. So you know what's coming.
Yes, I do.
What is it that you want listeners to get out of our time together today?
Sarah, I have heard that question over and over. And what I would hope is that people who are non-clinicians would, if there's a chance that they'll listen to this, that they'll hear somebody else who really doesn't know what they're doing, but sees themselves as part of the process of transformation or restoration is probably more what I would call it. That we all do have compassion and curiosity to offer, and that people who feel like I don't know enough to participate in that would maybe say, okay, well, she doesn't know anything either. But, but we're taking our steps to kind of bringing what we have to offer to that.
Well, I have a feeling you know more than you think you do, but we'll determine that as we go along.
Okay,
right?
All right. Well, yes, thanks.
Yeah.
Let me know.
Okay, we'll do. So, would you introduce yourself and tell folks what it is that you do in the world?
Sure. So I'm Kathy Nielson. I am foremost for this podcast, a head volleyball coach at a high school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with a group of young women who I love and respect and who probably teach me more about life, then I teach them. I also manage a small nonprofit that my husband and I started that focuses on affordable housing and safe spaces in the same neighborhood where I coach. And I am in the middle of a small social venture that's a pizza business that I started to employ some of our student athletes. So we say we're a pizza venture that we want to employ, train, and journey with young women from North Minneapolis. So that's what we do. Pizza is just a vehicle to do those other things together.
That's so incredible. Yeah, we were talking before we started recording, and we had you on here with the premise of you being, quote unquote, just a volleyball coach. And then you tell me all these other amazing things you're doing. It's so exciting.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's certainly a joy for me. And I feel like the things I get to spend my time on are for sure privilege. So
thank you for naming that.
Yeah.
So what brought you to OBT? What were you seeing in the world that you thought, I need to go to this trauma training?
Yeah, well, this is probably an hour-long question in and of itself. As you know, we talk a lot about in the training, and I think most of us know in our own lives that we all have our own things that we're working through. So that is definitely a piece. But I think the main thing that brought me to the online basic training was that the young women that I work with, we talk about the ACEs study, and I don't know if you want to say more about that, but I'm working in an environment where there's a lot of beauty and assets, but there's also a lot of trauma. And most of the players on my team, I think it's not a stretch to say, would score 6 or above on the adverse childhood experiences. And I have enough experience to know that deserves some respect. And so I'm constantly looking for ways to educate myself because I'm not a clinician, I am a coach. But the most important piece to me is the internal world of the players and the environment that we're creating in our gym and what that might mean for us now, but also as this ongoing network of women in our community. And so I literally Google stuff like effects of childhood trauma on young women and things like that. And I don't know how I had missed it before, but I came across the NARM podcast, the Transforming Trauma podcast with you. And as I've told you and a couple other people, I quickly binge listened to almost every one. One of the first ones was, Mike, who works with adolescents.
Yeah.
And some of the things he said were really powerful and hopeful for me. And I know enough to know that curiosity and understanding are transformative. I had previously volunteered at a women's space. I had an experience where I was riding in a car with one of the women and I asked a few questions like you might, and she had a relapse shortly thereafter. And I had this very deep experience where I felt like that was irresponsible of me to maybe enter into some of those spaces, not understanding triggers and all of those things at the time. This was years ago, more than a decade ago. And I think I've kind of always carried that with me. So while I don't have any expectation that I understand all of it, I often say when we enter into spaces that are new to us or not our area of expertise, like I say I have two choices. I can do it wrong or I can do nothing. And
whoa, that's brilliant. I love that.
Well, thanks. So I really try to hold to that. I have no intention of being reckless. So I'm not suggesting that we just wildly enter spaces that we're not trained to participate in. But I do think just in life in general, right, that it's a issue of we're doing the best we can. And it's grace and compassion and all of those things for ourselves and for other people. So when I found the Transforming Trauma podcast, I thought this is really something that could transform our gym and, what we're doing. And if we can create a safe space for our young women to find, it was that quote that sort of everyone is moving towards connection, every organism, right?
Moving towards life force and connection.
There you go.
Yeah.
And sometimes it would seem like people in the gym and otherwise don't want that.
Right.
But I think I know that. And I know enough to know that our leadership team, our group of coaches, that's our job we can't do that for anyone. It's our job to do it for ourselves first, but it is our job to provide some leadership in that space for those kind of moments of connection to happen. So then I listened to all the podcasts and I looked up for a practitioner in Minneapolis. And I called and left her a very rambling voice message. Do you think you could ever come and talk to our team and help me figure out what kind of gym would be good for the women? And she did call me back a couple of days later, which was amazing. And she said, you know what I think is that you should first go through the online basic training. They have a really good online basic training. And so I did. I looked into it and I signed up. And it's always kind of funny to go into our small groups and say, well, I'm a volleyball coach. But so I've been doing the online basic training and just each time feeling so grateful to have found it.
Well, the thing that I have found, because I've gotten to be an assistant in the basics training, and one thing that I found that's been so inspiring, because of course therapists are going to come, but when we see folks who are coming from professions without that clinical training, that's what's really inspiring, because I think one of the big hopes is that NARM, and I mean any trauma modality, really can infiltrate education systems and healthcare systems and other places. I mean, that's where the work is going to be done, right? We can't just continue to wait for folks to come to therapy for them to get better. We have to shift the systems. And so that is what's so inspiring about you showing up in the training and why we asked you here today.
Well, thank you. And I'll say in return, inspiring for somebody like me, Sarah, because I think sometimes professional environments can be a little closed off, just, hey, you don't really know anything about trauma, so let's not try, we'll leave that to us. But this whole idea, I shared with you that my husband was a physician, and there's this whole, I'm the expert and you're not. And he wasn't that kind of person. But I just think the accessibility that you guys offer. And I remember hearing Brad say, his hope was that it would infiltrate all these different environments. And so, yeah, how great would that be if most gyms across the country were full of, safe spaces for young athletes instead of what we sometimes have. So.
Right. Well, I'm curious to go back even before you discovered. So you were like, yeah, I'm Googling, adverse childhood experiences and all these things. What were you seeing in the gym that made you Google those things?
Yeah, I have a really distinct memory of a young woman who I was having conversation with her at practice. And I do try to ask questions when we're stretching or whatever. And she told me that she liked to draw. And so I was like, oh, I'd really love to see some of your drawings someday. At our next game, I noticed that she was a JV player. After the JV game and before the varsity game, it had been a hard game. We have a lot of hard games because, we don't quite have the experience that other schools have. She was drawing. And I asked her at practice the next day, I noticed you were drawing. Could you show me the drawing? What'd you draw? And she said, oh, I drew a self-portrait. And she went over to her notebook and she got me a self-portrait. And it was this picture of a beautiful young woman. And she said, do you want it? And I said, I'd love that. Thank you. Yes, I want it. And I took it home. And when I looked at it that night closer, it was a picture of head and shoulders, young female. And she had a tear coming out of one eye, but only one eye. And so I went to practice the next day and I asked her, I said, hey, I really think your drawing's beautiful. And I noticed she has a tear in only one eye. Is there something about that? And she didn't even hesitate, Sarah. She looked at me and she said, yeah, that's me. She said, the eye with a tear in it is what's going on inside of me most of the time. And the eye that doesn't have a tear in it is the side of me that I feel like I have to show the world. And, I knew it before, but I think that was a really solid moment for me that volleyball is not the most important thing happening here. And the reality is that most of our female athletes are not going to play college volleyball. And so I think that sort of led me to say, how can we provide a space that's giving them the opportunity to show both sides of themselves and to know that they have that somewhere and that potentially, here. So.
Right. Well, they're full selves.
Yes. Yeah. That's a great way to say it, right? Instead of just this side of us that you think people want to see or that you think people can handle or that you think people will respect and, to just offer them that dignity. So I have that in my quote, little office, which isn't really an office, but I framed it and she signed it for me. And now this small nonprofit that we have that developed right after my husband's death, we have a logo with a lion from an African proverb and one eye with a tear in it in honor of her drawing and just this reality of parts of our stories that we don't really know.
What an inspiration. And can you talk more about what the not-for-profit does?
Sure. The not-for-profit never started with the intention of a non-for-profit. My husband and I had the privilege of having a young man from the neighborhood that I now coach in. We lived in the suburbs at the time. He needed a safe and affordable place to live, and our youngest had just gone off to college, and we were speaking to somebody who knew his story. We didn't know him. And she said, yeah, he really needs a place to stay. And I was like, well, we have like the 3 bedrooms and the bathroom that our kids used. And I doubt he wants to live in the suburbs, but if he ever wanted to, he could come live with us. So short version is he came to live with us. And the more that we got to understand his story and his journey and the difficulties that the lack of affordable housing presents, the more we kind of wanted to be a part of that. But we knew enough to know that, young men living in our house would always be sort of that. It wouldn't be their space. But we also had learned very quickly that the proximity, sharing life and sharing space and running into each other over the ordinary things mattered. So we bought a duplex in North Minneapolis, the neighborhood that he was from. And we had a upstairs, downstairs, and then we added on kind of a community space, hoping that this would be a safe gathering spot for young men. And of course, the high school students, we have team meals there and things like that.
Wow.
So I just moved out of there about a month ago, but we still have that space. Just right after my husband's death, we had moved into the duplex 6 months before my husband died in a bicycle accident. So with his death, then I think more people became interested in the things that he and we cared about. And so we were able to, friends of ours bought the house immediately next door. It came for sale. And we have a young family living in that house now with a very affordable rent so they can pay down debt and have a safe place. And we bought another house in the neighborhood. So we have 3 small properties for that. But it's called Lions Inc. We had been on a bit of a personal journey towards racial reconciliation, my husband and I, and had the opportunity to participate in a trip through our church that was focused on, I think their definition, it's called Sankofa, but their definition would be sort of working toward a righteous response to racism. And we went on this, it was a life-changing trip for us. And we were at a home that had been used for the Underground Railroad. And at one point it was too much emotionally for me to take in all of the things that I was hearing and how I had been so distant from so much of that. And I kind of turned my head towards the wall, and the whole wall had like articles and information. And I turned my head to this quote. It was an African proverb, and it said, "Until the lion has his own historian, the hunter will always be the hero."
Yeah.
And so that kind of changed our perspective. And, we realized it's not our story to tell, but there is, deeper stories that we think we know that we just haven't heard from the other side. And so we got the lion from that, and we got the ink from like, what is the most basic thing somebody would need to write that true story?
There must be something amazing happening in Minneapolis. I actually was going to ask you more about how your students, because I know you work with a lot of African American women, how they've been affected by George Floyd's murder and all the racial reckoning that's been happening specifically in that area.
Yeah, thank you for asking. We have tried to save space for a lot of those conversations. And, Sarah, it's pain upon pain, right? And the unfortunate reality is that the young women that have the privilege of sharing life with, it's almost like most of us are having this deep awakening, right? And it's almost to them like the pain is so deep and so long that this isn't like almost even a moment. And, George Floyd's murder happened in South Minneapolis. We live in North Minneapolis, but North Minneapolis is the center of the Black community. So we weren't in the midst of like the large part of the rioting, but the neighborhood close to us did burn, and so much pain, but it's part of what their experience has been ongoing. And it's not a new or unexpected pain for them. And that's, I think, the heartbreaking reality. We're a few days after another man losing his life, being shot by authorities here. And it's very close to one of our players. And she actually works with us in the pizza truck. And it was the day after. And she said, but I want to come because my heart needs to be doing something. So, the resilience and the ability to find their way and to push through. I do have a great respect for the women on our team and the ways that they have navigated a world that has not I think the term that you use in NARM is environmental failures. I'm speaking more about systems than I am speaking about their
Yes.
families, because
Yes.
those mothers and fathers love their kids like all of the rest of us. But the system and the environment has left a mark generationally.
Hmm. Well, as you're talking, I'm just hearing so many things that you're doing and your way of being and approaching the students and the people that you're supporting. Like, I hear consent, that you really intend to get consent from folks, this really deep, unconditional, positive regard, which is the therapy term, right?
Oh,
But it's really respect, right? That you're sharing, and that's so NARMy.
well, thank you.
You're very authentically aligned with NARM.
Thank you. That's a great compliment to me, because just being in the NARM community, I remember saying in one of my very early, in this, when we break out in trainings and we have these conversations in dyads or triads, I remember saying to the people that I was with, like, when you get into a space like this where people do show compassion and curiosity, it seems very simple. And I was like, we could actually transform the world, and life along the way gets in the way for sure. I think I told you that my master's degree was in community ministry leadership, and it's mostly asset-based community development. But I see these worlds overlapping, because when you look at asset-based community development, they teach you that you don't decide what you're going to do. Like, I'm not going to go to North Minneapolis and make a pizza truck. They say you ask the question, what do you care enough to act on? That's the starting point. What do you care enough to act on in asset-based community development?
That's the initial question, is what do you want for yourself?
Yes. And
Wow.
so,
This is so cool.
and that's probably why it resonated so much in my heart, is that, I mean, these are obviously NARM principles and it's NARM language, but they're universal principles, right? And this idea of, seeing the dignity in everyone, that's not asset-based community development or NARM or the church thing, or it's just a true thing.
Right. Oh, wow. That's really cool.
Yeah, I thought that was very cool too. It makes so much sense.
I was really curious about, I can't remember the term that you used in terms of the trip that your church took, but what I was sort of hearing in there is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is it because Christianity has a lot of the times, like, the white saviorism and colonizing and that sort of stuff.
Mm.
Is this movement essentially trying to be better and do better and not swoop in and think like, we're white people, we're going to make this better for you?
Right. A little late, right? If that's what we're thinking. We did so much of the damage, like you say, with the colonizing, and so many people hurt by the church. Yes, I do think. I don't know. I couldn't tell you like where it officially started, but I know Sankofa it's something like looking back at the past in order to move forward. And so it's a bus trip, and it's one Black participant and one white participant, and you have a partner for the whole trip, and you go on. For us, we went on a bus ride. We went to some really significant spaces in the civil rights movement. It's the most emotionally uncomfortable I have ever been, to use NARM language. As white participants on that trip, you are really forced to sit in your helplessness. And not only your helplessness, but, I think what I spoke to you before, like this, where have I been? Why haven't we done better?
Well, white supremacy,
Yeah, minor little things like
right.
that. Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the proverb, right? And I hadn't thought of this before. I would love to hear your input on this. But if you think about it as far as the complex trauma, right? It's not so different. We have told ourselves a different story. Like in NARM, they talk about how those early childhood wounds, like the soul is forced to tell itself a different story to survive it, right? And I don't think it's really any different. We have told ourselves a different story in order to survive something that we should have reckoned with a long time ago. And so, yeah, I mean, hopefully we're moving toward hearing and seeing. And it's not as though people haven't been trying to tell us the story, but I wish I had been smarter, younger, for sure.
I think what you said, that rings really true for me. And I do so many podcasts, I can't even tell you which conversation it was, but I definitely had a conversation with somebody about that it's, if we talk about choosing authenticity or attachment, we always choose attachment because we need to be connected to our caregivers. And from a white supremacy perspective, authenticity or attachment, do we choose attachment to the group, right? To remain within the status quo and have power and that sort of stuff. So I think you're right on.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really curious to hear, how has being in the online basics training shifted, if anything, ways that you show up with your team right now?
Well, so we haven't been able to be in the gym practicing since I started
Mm.
basic training, because normally we would have some spring touch points. Our season is in the fall.
Oh, gotcha.
I haven't been in the gym, but I do stay in contact with my players. And, I say that I never had any illusions that I could fix. I'm talking about my own children, these young women that I love now. I've never had the illusion I could somehow fix problems. I just didn't have that kind of
Right.
confidence in myself. But I think I had the illusion that I should be able to.
Mm-hmm.
And again, for my own kids, I have a brother who's an alcoholic who I love very much, who I'm helpless, right? Take your pick. You don't have to go very far to find those spaces. So I can remember standing in my kitchen. I believe it was the first NARM training. No, it was the second NARM training. But in the second NARM training, they introduced that term unmanaged empathy. And I can remember standing in my kitchen, and I would have never noticed this until I started the NARM training, but I did have this actual physical release. And I was like, that's it. Like, unmanaged empathy. What I remember in myself at the time is like, that unmanaged empathy is about me. That's not helpful. And empathy is a good thing. Unmanaged empathy is destructive. And I'm someone who could lean towards codependency and unmanaged empathy. And honestly, I think probably one of the things that led me to trying to find the Transforming Trauma podcast, or whatever it was I was looking for, is this feeling of like, I have to do this right. And we have to like fix this. And we've got to like make somehow these girls become like excellent athletes, even though we have like all these other issues going on. We had a situation when I was an assistant coach where at the end of one school year, a significant number, 3, I think, we had 6 players suspended at the beginning of the fall because near the last day of school, our players had physically gotten into a fight with each other at school. So 6 of them were suspended to start the year. So there's a lot of things going on for all of us. But at that moment when I heard unmanaged empathy, I thought, Kathy, we're not going to like fix this. We're not trying to fix anybody. We're just going to do this together and try to create safe spaces so that these young women can get back to those true parts of themselves, right? So for me, that day was a release of like, it freed me up to be a much better coach moving forward.
I relate to that as a therapist. I also felt like, you're stabbing me in the heart with that one. But that piece of recognizing what it is that I want for the client instead of really tuning into what they want for themselves has been a game changer. Haha, game, and you play volleyball.
I like it. Keep up the sports fun. Are you familiar at all with the work of Father Greg Boyle?
Is he the guy who worked in LA with the gang? And what was his
Exactly.
book?
Yeah, Tattoos on the Heart.
Thank you.
And
Yes.
Barking to the Choir, he has 2. But I've probably listened to that book maybe 7 or 8 times. He's a wonderful inspiration, but he tells a story of, working with these gangs in LA, and a young man who had participated in their nonprofit. He was in the neighborhood and he saw this young man on the corner selling drugs. And he said he kind of watched from afar. And then the young man noticed him and
Noticed him noticing him.
yeah, yes, exactly. And, the young man had this kind of, I'm going to get the story a little bit wrong, but had this response of like, oh, I'm sorry, or, whatever. And Father Boyle said, no, he said, you taught me something today. He said, no amount of me wanting a life for you is going to matter until you want it for yourself. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned the sort of white savior complex, and there's, I'm sure, very fine lines, and I'm sure I've been on the wrong side of those lines at some times. But it is releasing this illusion that we can do anything. That's another asset-based community development principle. Don't do something for people that they can and should do for themselves.
Yes.
That's not empowerment, that's charity. And that's about you making yourself feel better.
Well, I'm curious too if you have any stories of how things have shifted with either your players or since you haven't been in the gym with the players, obviously it's a little bit harder to apply, but I suppose what shifts have you noticed inside yourself since you've been in the training? Other that you talked about the unmanaged empathy, but I'm curious, has it
Mhm.
changed the way you relate to your family and other folks that you encounter?
Yes, Sarah. I've noticed the way I relate to myself is different.
Mm,
Absolutely. Not just the unmanaged empathy,
mm.
but noticing for myself these small exercises of coming into the moment, and even Brad asking us questions about how are we receiving, how is it to be here from where you were before? That's one of the things actually that I think I will absolutely bring into the gym
Mm.
because coming from school and all of the other things and all the responsibilities you're trying to manage and all of the chaos, and then to just take time to notice what is it like to be in this space now. So for me as an athlete, I think I have spent most of my life, you try to kind of override what your body's telling you, if that makes sense.
Oh, I was a gymnast, so yes.
Okay, so yes,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And you have arrived at it much younger than me. But even just noticing, what do I need right now? What am I feeling? What is that unsettledness in me? And I think I mentioned that we hadn't been in the gym, but I do get to see my players. I feel fortunate for that. And after the first training, I had gone out to lunch with one of the players, and I noticed I was much more able to just be present,
Mm.
to hear her, to not feel like there was going to be something that I had to say or do at lunch to convince her to. She is a player who has switched to a few different schools. So I think prior had been this part of me, somehow I have to convince her to, stay at
Mm.
North. I have to make it so that she wants to. I have to. And I noticed that day with her at lunch, I was able to just be with her. I was able to hear, parts of her story. I was able to hear the things that were important to her,
Mm.
sort of absent of me trying to manipulate those into something that made us more successful as a team. I felt grateful for that after I left her that day, for sure. And the people closest to me, my own kids. One of the things that my kids say to me is that a quote I used to say in their childhood, when they were going through something hard, perk up, perky. Don't even remember saying that much, but they all sort of agree. We are in a season of grief in our family at the loss of my husband and their dad. And the thing about grief and some of that trauma is just this deep sense of helplessness, like we talk about,
Mm.
and being able to sit with that and not try to change it. And have a friend who's going through a painful divorce. And I think sometimes I missed it with her.
Mm.
And after the NARM training, I had to circle back. I wanted to circle back
Mm.
and say, forgive me
Mm.
for trying to solve that for you or trying to fix that for you. And there was a story, Sarah. One of my coaches told me, oh, at this other school, the younger players, they have the older players coach like the very new players.
Mm.
They don't have coaches coach them, they have the younger players. And she said, yeah, the coach said, I want those younger players to realize it's a privilege to make it to the point where I'm coaching them. And I had this really serious reaction of wait a second, I want the first thing our players when they walk in the gym to know is it's our privilege to coach them. It's not a privilege for them to be coached by us. And I think sometimes in this sports world, it can be
Mm.
you will do what I say and you will do it our
Mhm.
way. And I hope that we have a different tone when we're back together.
Mm. Well, I think maybe the last question is a big question, so take it wherever you want to, but what would you like to see change in the high school sports world that incorporates more of what we're doing in NARM?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's probably best to speak of what do I hope will change in our
Yeah.
gym. But this last online basic training was introducing agency. And I do think we have a unique opportunity in gyms even though they're high school students, so they're still living with their families, they're not adults, they're not making all of their own decisions. But I do hope that we can create an environment where they understand that they are making decisions on how that space will not only grow themselves, but that they understand the decisions we make are not only affecting us, but we're also have the opportunity to create space for other people to live into themselves more fully. They often say in sports that the best player is the one who makes the players around them better. And I mean, that's true. It's interesting, right? Trying to meld these two concepts of agency, but also like a collectiveness,
Right.
And showing up for each other in ways that respect the needs and the survival styles and, what each person brings into the gym, this mutual respect for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then also sort of this responsibility for, I don't know if you've heard that. I heard this story once talking through mental toughness with athletes. It's a guy who was a builder and he worked for years and years tirelessly for this agency. And he was ready to retire and he was a perfectionist. And they said, we just have one last house we want you to work on. And he was like really exhausted and working on this house. And he kind of like didn't do it to the extent, the carefulness that he would use on the other houses. And then at the end, they said, we have one last thing. And they had this ceremony and they gave him the keys, and the house he was building was his own house. And so in gyms all over, like this idea that you're building your own house and you have everything you need. You have what you need, and let us help you make space for that. And I hope we can find ways to bring that out in people,
Well, that's a beautiful way to end, but I'd love for you to share information for the pizza place and your not-for-profit so that people can connect with you.
Best way to reach us at the pizza place is lionsfirempls@gmail.com. We purposely don't have a website or anything like that yet because we're scaling up and figuring out how to do this well. But yes, if you're in the Minneapolis area and you're looking for some good pizza with a purpose, we like to say, that's us. The small nonprofit is called Lions Inc. We do have a small website for that. That's lionsinc.org. And
that's INK.
Sorry, yes, INK. So yeah, that's the best ways to find us.
Wonderful. Well, I did say at the beginning, you might know more than you think you do. And I'm going to hold true to that. That's how I feel after listening to you, and the way that your heart is so open and you're so compassionate. It's beautiful. And I'm so glad I got to share space with you today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Please join us starting in September for our NARM Online Basics Training to learn how to transform trauma. This NARM Online Basics Training is available for helping professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Now more than ever before, it is essential that we learn how to resolve complex trauma and support post-traumatic growth. If you're looking for more advanced training in understanding the impacts of attachment, relational, developmental, and intergenerational trauma, and you're working in healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or other allied fields, join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-Informed Professional. For more information and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.